Okay, so look, we're continuing in our series on the life of Christ, and this segment for the last several weeks and for the next several weeks is on the crucifixion. We just a reminder as when they at one point when Jesus, I think it was after the transfiguration, when his glory was open to everybody, is that when he came down, it says that he turned his face towards Jerusalem. That meant that no matter what he was doing ahead of time in the northern part of the country, healing people, doing whatever, now it was time to go to Jerusalem. And that's what this whole segment that I've been doing on the crucifixion is about. That culminates, and we're in the middle of it, but culminates in the last week of his life. And I think something like, I forget the number, I gave it to you once before, so you guys can correct me, is that at least a third of the Gospels is just the last week of his life. So you got 3 years of his birth and public ministry, and then a third of the Bible is just one week. And that's pretty much what we've been covering. So, you got to think about what Jesus went through. What was Jesus's world? I mean, from the time that he would wake up until he would go to sleep, what was his life? His life was just constant pressure, opposition, stress. I mean, just all of that. You read very few accounts of where Jesus is just kicking back, got his lounge chair on the Sea of Galilee. Hey, I got a couple of days off. I mean, not that I mean it didn't, because obviously the scriptures don't cover, everything in all the accounts, but it's always something. So when we saw people opposing him for some of the acts that he does, he goes into the temple and he heals someone, and immediately the Jewish leaders are after him, and it's just, he's controlled by Satan, or we've got to kill him. We got to get rid of him. Isn't it? The whole time that it goes through, everything is like that. They sent, we saw a couple of weeks ago in the segment that I called Setting the Traps, where they would send people from the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin to come and try to catch him in questions. They would ask him questions, those kind of questions that, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. When did you stop beating your wife? I mean, those kind of questions. So those are the kind of questions that they're asking him, but they're theologically, based. But he's always got to be on his toes for what's happening. So last week we talked about the betrayal by Judas to Jesus. And what I did was we started out with, in Matthew, where it said, that he went to the Pharisees, or he went to the leaders and asked, hey, how much are you going to give me if I turn Jesus over to you? We're in Matthew 26 is where we'll be, if I can find it. That'd be right before 27, right?
9:22.
Okay. So let's see. So then in 14, verse 14, it says, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. And we spoke about the 30 pieces of silver being the price of a slave, as it said in Exodus 30, I think it was. I'll just make that up. But anyway, I think it was Exodus 30. But and also when we saw something in Zechariah where it talked similar about that. So there was a meaning to what the 30 pieces of silver were. They may have thought, we're giving 30 pieces of silver without even thinking about what that, without giving any thought that it meant something, but it's all prophecy being fulfilled. What we didn't cover, and we're not going to cover really, is the Passover. because that's what they're going to do, because it says in 17, now on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, where will you have us prepare to eat the Passover? We'll save that for later in the spring. Like we were doing the other Jewish holidays, we did the holidays that come in the fall, so now we'll do the ones that come in the spring. Purim was just last week. We'll study that. I'm thinking about doing the book of Esther after we finish all this, and Purim comes out of the book of Esther. So we'll cover the Passover then. But at the Passover, here's my point. At the Passover is when he said, one of you will betray me. And I think we covered this last week. He said, the one that I dip the bread in and give, we'll do it. And all of the disciples, said, is it me? Because they're sensitive to the fact that we can all betray Christ. Like I said, because we always see Judas, and he's always kind of the bad guy with the black beard and the beady eyes, and that they would all turn and look down the table at Judas when he said that. And that isn't what the case was. And even as Jesus is handing the morsel to Judas, he says, is it I? Oops, like losing at some dice game or something. So anyway, and we talked about some of the implications of the betrayal, and then he goes off and they finish the Passover. That's where Jesus will predict Peter denying him 3 times. Because what he's saying is that, you guys all deny me, after tonight, you guys are all going to deny me and you're all going to scatter. And Peter stands up and says, maybe they will, but not I. And that's when Jesus said, before the rooster crows, you'll have denied me 3 times. So that comes out of that part that we didn't cover. Okay. So then we get to, and then we had the institution of the Lord's Supper, which we're not going to cover because I don't want to include that in the crucifixion, stuff that we've got going there. So now we have to get Jesus to the garden. Where is that? Let's see here. Jesus prays in Gethsemane. This is verses 36 through, what does it say on the top of your? 36 to 40. Anybody want to read? Anybody want to grab the microphone? And so that the microphone doesn't necessarily amplify in the room here, so you still have to talk loud. It does it if anybody's online. So thank you very much. 36 to 46.
Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. And he took with him Peter and the piece of the bread and began to be grieved and depressed. Then he said to them, my soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain in fear and keep watch with me. And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, so you then could not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, my Father, if this cannot pass away unless I drink it, your will be done. Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were weary. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand.
Very good. You're a keeper. You can't go home. One, he volunteered to read, and he read very well. Anyway, thank you. Anyway, so again, this goes back to now Jesus does get a point now where he can go to the garden, And I don't think anybody calls it a garden. I think only John mentions that it's a garden. You know, everybody just calls it the Mount of Olives, and it's a wine place where they have olives and the oil and the wine presses there. And we all call it the Garden of Gethsemane, but you know, it's not referred to that way. But again, this is a time that he can go, get out of the way. You got to remember, even in the upper room for the Passover, a whole bunch of people there. It wasn't just him and the 12 disciples, a whole bunch of people. Had to have the women there cooking, right? No, but they had a whole bunch of disciples that were there. We see at the beginning of the book of Acts. So that's 40 days later, 40 some days later, when Jesus comes back, tells them to wait, you know, in Jerusalem, Galilee, I forget which. Anyway, Jerusalem probably. Tells them to wait there, you know, until the Holy Spirit comes. And it says there was 120 there. So now he goes to the garden. He's just got his 11 now because Judas is gone. He's got them, and he's going to go up and he's going to pray. So he's got some time of peace. He brings his three, you know, the three top disciples with him up there, and they stay at a distance, and he can't even get peace there because every time he turns around, you know, the snoring is bothering them, I think, you know, bothering him, interrupting his prayer. You know, gotta remember, these are people. I mean, I may joke about that kind of stuff, but why not? He's sitting there trying to pray, and all he hears is people sawing logs behind him. You know, and he goes, man, you guys can't even stay up. You know, like that. They go, yeah, well, we got this, You know, then right away after that, you know, they're asleep again. Okay, so now is that story in the garden familiar to everybody? I mean, okay, so we don't have to go into detail. So Judas rushed to the chief priest to carry out his plan while Jesus was giving final instructions to the 11. This is the end of the upper room for the Passover. So after comforting the disciples and attempting to prepare them, Jesus led them out of the city down a deep ravine known as the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives, a hill opposite Jerusalem, where he and his disciples had been spending the night. Who's been to Jerusalem? I know Deacon Dennis has, right? Anybody else been to Jerusalem? Sherry, Carrie? Okay. Did you guys go to the Mount of Olives?
Yes.
Is it the way I described it? I haven't been there.
Yeah.
I said in the Kidron Valley, a ravine known as the Kidron Valley. And they went up to the Mount of Olives, a hill opposite Jerusalem. Did I do that okay? Dennis, do my phone.
It's all fenced off now, and they got holes in the fence where you can reach through and touch a tree. Because people were taking parts of the trees and going home with them to their home church.
Yeah.
So they finally had to lock it all down, put it all in lockdown.
People will make an idol out of anything.
But between the garden, the big garden, down in the Kidron Valley and then up to the wall of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
All you can stand there and see it all at one time.
Yeah.
It's quite something.
Yeah. So anyway, so it was Passover week. The city's overflowing with pilgrims. The population of Jerusalem was around 50,000, and it ballooned up to around 200,000 during Passover. Now we can picture this. So we're around 50,000 people here in Havasu. What happens when all the winter residents and visitors come? You know, all of a sudden you have to wait a couple hours to get you at the pharmacy to get your prescription filled. You can't get an appointment at the doc. Am I telling the truth? Can't get an appointment at the doctor. You go to get something at the grocery store and they're out of it. Like that. See, we have our own agonies that we go through. No, but anyway, but that was the condition of Jerusalem at the time. You know, there's a couple of verses in Galatians that where Paul is speaking. He says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." Paul's saying that there came a time that was in God's planning, that was that appropriate time. Most of the time we apply that to, we make it a Christmas verse, that God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law. We make that kind of a Christmas, Christmas verse, but it's really talking about his whole life, his whole earthly ministry, because all these things had to be happening at the same time. So now you got a city that's full and people are agitated just because it's so full. I mean, you used to sit in second car back at a stop sign on Mesquite, and now you're 10 cars back at a stop sign, and you get what Pastor talked about, the things that irritate you. Let me give you my list now. No, but but all of those people there, one, as witnesses to what the events are, but two, they make the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, act differently, because now what can I do? We got all these people in town, half of them like them, and things like that. So anyway, so all the lodging was taken. So the only place they could stay was out at the Mount of Olives. A large crowd prompted the Sanhedrin's decision to put Jesus to death before the Passover. An arrest in a public place such as the temple, while he was surrounded by a crowd that considered him the Messiah, might lead to a riot. Only 5 days earlier, the crowd had shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," when Jesus entered the city. We talked about that when we talked about the triumphal entry. So the authorities knew, Jesus had charisma and crowd appeal. He knew how to work the crowds. A revolt against Rome could easily develop among the enthusiastic and impassioned crowds. Even if Jesus had no political ambitions, insurrection remained a possibility. So the Jewish leaders are stuck with all this, and we got big crowds here, that are happening. Do we just say, well, let's wait till the winter visitors go home and then we'll handle the issue? Or do they say, no, wait, we got to do it in quiet somewhere else where they won't even know, what happened? And these are the things that, that Jesus had to put up with. So let's see what else I got here. He said, and as the we talked about a couple of weeks back about the high priest in the Sanhedrin standing up and saying, when they're talking about Jesus and about killing Jesus, and he says, it's expedient for you that one man should die and that the whole nation should not perish. And he didn't realize how prophetic he was. He said, it's better that we kill Jesus so he doesn't upset the Romans. And then they take away our whatever power they had or whatever luxuries they had of being in charge, of their groups. It's better that he dies than all of us, get whacked. And that's exactly what that situation, is, because that's prophetic. So anyway, so Jerusalem was a powder keg, and that's the timing that Jesus is there. So that's what we see as he goes into the garden. Oh, I know one other thing. And I think we talked about this in the Friday's Master of Men class some time back. But when that's being prophesied, it's better that one man die than all of us, the whole nation, perish. That Jesus had been talking about that all along. They just don't know it. Because what happened within that generation? The Romans came down, destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and this wasn't some small, thing. I remember one time I read out of Josephus to the Friday class description of what those Jewish wars were like and how many people, were killed. In Jerusalem, over 1 million non-combatants were killed during those Jewish wars between 66 and 70 AD, within that generation that Jesus had said in Matthew 24, this generation shall not pass away before these things, these things happen. So, there was 100,000 people killed in Galilee at that time, and there was almost 100,000 people put into slavery. So that was a big deal. That's what the Jews feared. They probably didn't have a perception of how large that would be, but that's what they feared when they said, we've got to kill him. We got to get rid of Jesus. We can't let this happen to where it boils up to where the crowds would be following him and preventing him, but also upsetting Rome. Were you going to say something, Denny?
I was just wondering if they knew what set the Romans off after that, because this fight Jesus.
No, it was the Jews rebelling against Roman, what were they? They weren't a colony, but they were part of the Roman Empire. They were ruled outside of their will. Not much different than our Revolutionary War. Where we were under British control, even though it wasn't quite so bad because we were way far away. But and then we rebelled. Now we happened to come out on the good side.
But before that, Rome had just allowed the Jewish people to worship as they wanted to, and so on.
As long as there was peace, that's that Pax Romanus. As long as there's peace, we don't care. You pay your homage to Caesar once a year and it's peaceful, they don't care. Yeah.
Yeah, just jumping off what he said too, is like, if you think even a little bit further back, you have King Herod and his descendants. I mean, these are men who are, they are kings of the Jewish nation, but they are corrupt. And they are accusers of Rome. So Rome oversaw them. But obviously, like what he said, they did give the Jewish people some autonomy and some government, but they could not put anyone to death without Roman authorization, and that's why Pilate comes in. And that comment you made is really critical, that as long as there's no threat to Rome in Israel, they are allowed to command it and take over it.
Right, yeah, I mean,
Rome had done that with a lot of other countries at that time.
I'm sorry?
Rome had done that with a few other countries too at that time.
With all the countries that they took over and controlled, or however they, received them into the Roman Empire, that was their thing. Like I say, that's what the Pax Romanus was, peace in the Roman Empire. You stayed peaceful, pay your tribute, and God bless you, live your life. Like that. Now, see, the thing is that Jesus wasn't the threat to the Roman Empire. Like that. And I think I've read this up before, and we'll talk about it as Jesus goes through the various trials. But when Jesus comes before Pontius Pilate, I don't think Pontius Pilate even knows who Jesus is. That's why you read the account, and other than maybe what somebody told him when they brought Jesus to him, but I don't think that Pontius Pilate ever was sitting around saying, there's trouble out in the Galilee lands, and it's led by this Jesus guy, this Jesus freak, No, he's led by this Jesus guy. We better watch him. We never see the Romans watching out for Jesus. I don't think that he was a threat to them at all. Ray.
Well, the thing that I see is they probably would tolerate peaceful protests, but they didn't want to see riots.
Right.
They see anything that disturb the peace as being riotous.
Yeah.
And they're going to quell it one way or the other.
Yeah. I mean, we even see that in the book of Acts with Paul. Paul comes to Jerusalem and Paul's preaching. Nobody's having a problem with Paul until the Jews start rioting against him. Mm-hmm. And then the Romans intercede to arrest Paul. One, probably to protect Paul.
Yeah, he's a Roman citizen.
But he's a Roman citizen, but also to take him out of it, to diffuse, the situation. Frank.
Wouldn't anything that upsets the norm upset them, being that no matter what was going on, in some ways, they want to keep everything the way it is, because this is the way it's done. So whether it was Jesus or anybody upsetting the norm, they would be upset.
You know what, I don't know if they cared about what was happening to the Jews. You know, I mean, it's up to them to handle. This is your problem. You know, you handle it. And, you know, it'd be like here, if we had an issue here in Havasu, we don't want the feds coming in. The feds probably don't want to come in. They go Lake Bear, you know, like that. So, well, no. So, I mean, we may call the sheriff for help. You know, you're keeping it localized and Aaron.
One other comment too that makes Jesus, right, he didn't seek anything political out of this. But it does lean at another theme. The Jewish culture, at least at that time, what we see in the scriptures, is tumultuous all the time, to say the least, because you had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and what was the fourth group?
Yeah.
The Essenes, you got
So,
the
like,
elders and the,
Jesus figured out a way to tick all of them.
right.
And like, these are people that are already very firm in their traditions. And Jesus is challenging kind of, if you go through all the gospels, there are situations where Jesus is dealing with different groups of the Jewish people. And his use of Old Testament scripture, combined with him just not being what any of the Jewish groups expected, that really does contribute to a lot of this unrest. And I think the Jewish people, at least all the groups, kind of came together on one thing. This man needs to be
Exactly. You weren't here a couple of weeks ago. I said, actually, Jesus wasn't all that nice of a guy. He just went around poking all these different groups in the eyes, you know? And then when he brought up about, and we discussed this a couple of weeks ago, when he brought up about the resurrection, and he's asking the Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection, you know, but the Pharisees do. So now he's got the Pharisees going against the, you know, the Sadducees. You know, Jesus probably just made an about face, walked off, and let them fight amongst themselves.
It's kind of cool is later on, and I think the book of Acts, St. Peter uses the same tactic when he's brought before a group of Jewish leaders, and he starts kind of making the groups argue against each other, and that allows him to kind of anyway.
No, it's a good tactic, because again, Jesus isn't the issue. Their misreading of scripture is or their lack of understanding of Jesus said, you know, in fact, it goes back to this part about, you know, the woman who was married 7 times and widowed 7 times, and in the resurrection, you know, whose wife is she? And that's when, you know, the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. And, but he says, you're wrong because you don't know scriptures, you know, and that's always the case. They know the traditions. They know the traditions of man. They know what's been passed down, you know, through the periods of time like that. I don't think that Jesus ever had a bona fide argument with the Jewish leaders where they break open the Bible and say, let's read this passage and let's come to understanding. It was always that thing of the traditions of man and the way that they not even so much interpreted the scriptures, but that they wanted to make some of those scriptures bigger than they were. So anyway, so Jesus is in the, so that's the thing. So what they're trying to avoid by killing Jesus comes about in 70 AD, and they lose the city. They lose the city anyway. So, but Jesus was, you know, helpful to them. So, you know, so Jesus would spend his days preaching in the city, and then they would go up to the Mount of Olives, and that would be their, you know, place of rest, right?
Well, the whole thing is a matter of control. That the Jews had their control over the people. You can go into the temple, you cannot go into the temple. And the one thing they saw in Jesus, we can't control this.
That's right. No, that was the thing, is that they were always able to control, you know, people. We talked about when he, you know, when he tossed over the tables and all of that, you know, in the temple. not only could they not stop him, but I mean, my view of that is always, and then he turned around and left town, but it isn't. You read the scripture and it says, and then he stayed there and he preached some more and he healed some people. And the Jewish leaders couldn't do anything. I mean, they were just, they were just stymied, over it. Oh, I thought I saw a hand go. I thought somebody wanted to get saved and raise their hand like that, so.
The other thing too is that they were scared about the people. That's why they said, they talked to Judas and said, I find a place where we won't have a crowd around us. So find something where we can arrest him without concern about the public getting involved in this thing. You
Yeah.
don't need that.
Yeah. Well, on your sheet, what I did was I took some things here and I listed them out that are talking about Jesus' time in the in the garden. I got there, Jesus' sorrow reveals his true humanity. This is a big thing. Jesus is truly man. He's not half man, half God. He's fully man, fully God. And we don't know how that works. I mean, we just don't know how that works. But in this situation, he's all man. And that's why he has these times of sorrow. And we'll see him with the sweating of the blood. So anyway, number 2, Jesus' anguish fulfills prophecy. Isaiah 53:3 calls him a man of sorrows. Number 3, the weight of the world's sin. Jesus bears the full burden of mankind's sin, which causes his agony. And the reference there is 2 Corinthians 5:21, and this talks about how Paul's speaking, and he's saying how God has, through his finished work, has already reconciled himself to man. Okay? It's not even a work that's going on today. He's already reconciled himself to man, working through Christ. And then verse 20 gets down to verse 20. That's 5, I think. 5:17 in 2 Corinthians talks about, you're all renewed in Christ. You're a new creation. Okay, and then 5:18 goes into that reconciliation because God's at the cross. God already reconciled man to himself, okay, through Christ. But in verse 21, it says, for our sake, this goes back to Jesus in the garden now, okay? It says, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Okay, that's what Jesus knows his work on the cross is going to be. And that's why he's going to be in such sorrow and agony and turmoil in the garden, because that is a heavy weight to put on a person. I mean, all the sins of the world, I have trouble enough with my own sin, carrying it around. Imagine all the sin of all the people in the world. And on these sheets, I recommend you take them home, look up the verses and all this stuff, make yourself your own little study on the garden and that. Number 4 is the cup of God's wrath. Jesus prays about the cup, referring to God's righteous judgments. And the cups will be a whole thing that we do when we get to the Passover, okay? Because there's a lot of interchange there, and even what they do with the cups in the Passover, Passover service. And it says, not my will, when he's praying, he says, not my will, but yours. That's a Luke passage. Now, Luke's a little bit different, okay, what he has like that. But I think we're all familiar, with Jesus at the end of his prayers to God, says, not my will, but your will, God. Because he's saying, not my will, my human will, but your will be done. Let's see. Well, let's get to the sweating blood. Who knows the sweating blood story? Who doesn't know the sweating blood story? All right, familiar, huh?
I'd like a review.
Okay. Let's get to the sweating blood. Ray can tell you all about the sweating blood. I was teasing Ray. You know, Ray always fact checks me. Now he's using AI to fact check me.
Can I share this with them?
But yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
But talk loud enough so everybody can hear.
Okay.
Your voice doesn't carry very well.
Well, what I did is that, I had Chat GPT on my computer for that. And what I did was split screen this thing for those of you that are knowledgeable about it. And I took Gene's email and his letter or his topic for the day. And what I did was highlight each individual PowerPoint. And then ask the question of Chat 8 and GPT on there and put it to reason. And reason is one of the options that you have at the bottom of it. And what it does, it gives you, within seconds, it gives you a breakdown of what each individual question or each PowerPoint is being presented. And you can do, like Gene said, you can do the whole thing. And just highlight it, Control C and do that, and then ask and put it to Chat GPT or one of the other ones. You don't have to do that. I logged on to, I took my laptop to Master's Man, and I got on there because I didn't have that. I didn't have my Chat GPT, but I get onto the iPod. iPod is an AI on there.
You ask him what you ask him what the ingredients are in the pancakes?
Yes, they put mustard in.
I was gonna say, maybe we don't want to know. Anyway,
It does give you a breakdown on Chat.
for anybody who doesn't know on AI, it's artificial intelligence. And but it doesn't come from space, it doesn't come from Martians and all that. But you get in there, you put a question, doesn't matter what the question is. I mean, you put a question about anything, or just about anything, I guess. It'll give you an answer. I mean, 2 seconds.
It's not always right.
Well, no.
I can
Well,
tell you
no,
that.
wait, no,
I
well,
was gonna say,
wait, it's,
putting questions in for a Bible study, I
it's-
take everything it says.
well, it's right if you figure it, or if you prompt it properly. Now, this sheet here, and this is an abbreviated, I usually do these with 50 points, but I've written papers on theology and Christianity and all of that for the 45 years I've been a Christian. And I probably have a couple of hundred papers on all of this stuff. And what I've been doing is I've been uploading the actual papers to AI. And I ask you to take my paper with my headings, break it down into 50 bullet points from a confessional Lutheran perspective. So that way I don't get the Baptist stuff, or whoever it might be. And then all you got to do is just read. You got to remember, it's my paper, I wrote it. But you can also ask it at the end, what are your sources? And it'll tell you what this. Anyway, but you have to read it. You have to make sure that it's, that it's correct. But anyway, so he took what I uploaded to AI that produced that, and then he took that, uploaded that to AI to produce a longer version, of it. I only bring this up because it's really no different than if you Google something.
No.
Except for it's a little more prompt. Google gives you an article that you have to go in and read the article, where this will, do what you want. Frank.
To me, all this is parallelization by canalization. You're taking this
It's what?
way beyond, everybody's getting this AI, this GPT, AI, and blah, blah, blah.
I just want to point it out to people who are unfamiliar with it, that it's there.
I know what it is.
Yeah.
I'm saying you can overanalyze.
Well, you probably do that with
Analyzation
anything.
by analyzation, you'll sit there and look at this stuff and you won't get nothing done because you're analyzing everything.
Well, I think we get a lot done.
If Jesus was a robot.
I think we.
Well, I mean, that'd be perfect, right? He's a robot.
No, he's not a robot.
Well, how do you know that?
Okay, let's move
I'm
on.
just saying, you're over, I could analyze that too. So-
Anyway, so let me do this.
Bring you back to the point of the blood. What I asked.
Well, I'm gonna talk about the blood now, otherwise we're gonna run out of time.
Okay.
All I was making the point was, I'm sure Ray could tell us about the blood. So what did I do with it here? What is this? 22 in Luke. Let's see. He says, Father, this is in Luke 22. He says, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. That's where we had a couple of points ahead. There appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony. And this is why it's called the agony in the garden. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation. So Luke's the one who brings up about the great, the sweats of blood. Luke's a doctor. He's a physician. He looks at things differently. Now here's the thing, is that, but Luke wasn't on the Mount of Olives. So how does he know? Well, if you go back, and this is what we're doing on Fridays in Master's Men, we're starting the book of Acts, and in his introduction in Luke and in Acts, he says that he did this through his own research. That he searched out all these things. So he's talking to people who were eyewitnesses or were close to eyewitnesses. And I try to picture it this way. So he comes to one of the other gospel writers, and he says, Matthew. He goes John. Of course, Luke wrote before John, but he'd still go to John because John was still there. He goes, John, you were in the garden with Jesus. You were one of the three that was close to him. Tell me what happened. And then John says, I don't know, I was asleep. No, no, but he's describing the situation, and he's talking about what anguish. I'm making this up, just so you know. Okay. He's in such anguish that, man, it seemed like he was sweating blood like that. And then Luke goes, I'm a doctor. I know about this stuff, And so he ends up by, remember, it's only a line in the scripture. It's not like he wrote a whole thesis on that. But I have a thesis here on it. It's called hematohydrosis. hematohydrosis. It's called the bloody sweat. But it talks about Jesus being under such pressure and such strain, that they talk about how, your blood vessels start to pop. And I don't know if I've ever been under that kind of stress. I know I've been that mad before. Another one of those things that irritates me. No, but so it's talking about, I think that the point is that Luke wants us to see what pressure Jesus was under at this moment. You got to remember, he's all man, he's fully man, and he's going through man stuff in there. It's not like he's got his God part floating over him, to reassure him. It's not like I got this covered. I read about it in Old Testament prophecies. this isn't going to bother me at all. This is just like if any of us had gone through what he had been going through and now was in that, I don't know if it's a confrontation, but he's almost like he's negotiating with God. If there's any other way, God, let this cup pass. He's not negotiating. I mean, this is where you end up by butchering. And remember, my old statement is that all heresies come out of the Bible because people, teachers, preachers, myself, will say one phrase too many in trying to describe something. And when you get to that part where you can go, this is what I think's happening, but I don't know, you're okay. But then when you say, let me tell you what was happening, that doesn't say in the scriptures. That's where it's a problem. So anyway, so it talks about this hematohydrous, and it says this state of mind would have produced the nervous system's automatic response to a life-threatening situation. You get cold, pale skin, profuse sweating, a pounding heart, tightening of muscles. It's not that he was just facing death, but look at the kind of death that he was facing. You look at what he had to go through before he was even, from his arrest until he was on the cross. So anyway, so all of this stuff, is happening, to him. I mean, I got a whole thing here about the medical stuff on that, but that part doesn't matter. What matters is that this note here says, as we ponder this scene, let us remember that Christ, just like any human being, suffered not only physically, but emotionally as well. His mental suffering, his anxiety over what was to come, his anguish as he struggled to accept the cross, were not easier for him because of his divine nature. In his human nature, he was like us in every way, except he never sinned. Okay, and that's and the reason I bring all this up is because as we go into the rest of the story after his arrest and all the trials and the beatings that he goes through, is we have to understand he's doing this as a fully human person. Ray had mentioned to me earlier that he'd put a question into the AI, asking something to the effect of, well, wait, Jesus knew about this for 2,000 years, so why'd this come like as a surprise to him now? But the thing is no. See, you can't even say it right. Can't even say, well, his God side knew, but his human side didn't, because you can't separate the sides. But for his human nature, he had no idea that this was coming. Okay. I think that somewhere in that, he knew something was up, but we don't know what he knew, was up. Maybe he knew what the Jews should have known, because he knew the scriptures, that he knew the prophecies. But all he knows is, okay, Messiah is going to come, Messiah is going to die, but doesn't tell you how, doesn't tell you under what conditions or stuff like that. So I got a feeling that as he walked the earth, he knew what was available to the Jewish leaders. Again, so maybe I stepped into heresy there. So Jesus was already physically and emotionally drained, but the night was only just beginning. Already in the distance, he heard the muffled sounds of a crowd approaching the olive grove. And that's where Judas is coming with the Jewish leaders to arrest him. And obviously, Jesus knows that much because he's the one who told Judas what was going to, what was going to happen. So then as we continue, we're not going to go into the arrest today. We'll do that. We'll do that next week. But my point is in trying to figure out the real world that Jesus was in, was all of pain, suffering, stress on his part, even as the God man. Because I'll say for me, You know, a lot of times I'll just get cozy just thinking, yeah, I'm glad Jesus died for me. And that's as far as, you know, like it was nothing for him to get up on the cross or to spend those 30 years on earth. I mean, God coming in human form to have to be on earth with all the restrictions that are involved in being a person instead of God, you know, like that. And because in Philippians, it talks about how he laid aside, you know, he didn't get rid of the God nature, but he laid it aside. He wasn't going to use it. You know, same thing when they said, you know, about, you know, when he tells the people, no one knows the day or the hour of the return, not even me. How could he not know? You know? Now, I bet he knew before, and I'll bet he knows now. But the time that he was here, he didn't know. Because he had that human limitation. Okay. Do we recognize the human limitations, us versus God, what God knows? You know, in Isaiah, God says, you know, my ways aren't your ways. My ways are far above your ways. And we just read through that stuff without, I don't think, without pondering what it, you know, what it really means. So we'll see next week. They're going to come. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to give you a spoiler alert. Yeah, no, they're gonna come, and they're going to arrest them, and there's going to be transactions that are happening there because also Jesus is going through all of these as examples to his disciples, and to the Jewish leaders. Because remember, after his resurrection, they go, "Oh, he did tell us about that. We didn't get it." So he's going through these things with them also. So during the arrest, we'll see some, and then as he starts getting brought before the Jewish leaders, before the Roman leaders. Diane.
Because I always thought when he was like at the dinner and all that, and even when he was born, he was always contacting his father.
Right. Well,
I
right.
mean, he was always, you know, wouldn't he know what he was doing all the time because his father would tell him?
Well, does our Father tell us?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's the same. Again, it's one of those things, we don't know how that all interacts, you know, and the first great heresies of the church, you know, after like in the 2nd century and the 3rd century, were all trying to figure out that relationship between God, Jesus being God and being man. Some would say, no, really, he was just God. He wasn't really man. That was kind of like an apparition. Others would say, no, he was man, but he wasn't God. And they're just all kinds, there's like 6 or 7, you know, heresies like that, where people are, and I'm not blasting the people. This is this is hard stuff, especially, see, we think that the disciples would know, or the first church would know. But you know, the first church, they're trying to survive. They're being scattered. They're spreading out themselves. They're talking about this guy, Jesus. And then somebody says, yeah, but what's that relationship between the Trinity? I mean, this, you know, this God the Father, and who's Jesus and who's the Holy Spirit and how do they interact? And they went 200 years with never really discussing that because it wasn't a topic. They're just preaching Jesus Christ and him crucified. Then someone, a couple of centuries later, says, hey, I figured this out. I figured out this Trinity stuff.
Well, that's not exactly how the Council of Nicaea would have put it, because that is where the doctrine of the Trinity came to be. It wasn't one person, it was all the bishops.
No.
Yeah.
What I'm saying, no, you're right, but see, that's 325 and 381. That's long time. But here's the thing: it started because Arius, who the council was called against, because he said Jesus is not eternal God.
Right, but it's not a heresy that had just started happening at that time. It was something that as Christians and Jewish Christians and Gentiles who might have been in association with Roman gods who became Christian, they started bringing these sort of questions. So it wasn't like the heresy had just popped up all of a sudden. It was something that as Christianity was growing over time. And these were also questions that St. Paul actually starts diving into in some of his epistles. But going into it more, it's stuff that became more and more prominent because of these heresies that the church needed to deal with. It wasn't necessarily that it just came out of nowhere and they needed.
No, I'm not saying it came out of nowhere. What I'm saying though, is by the time they got around to addressing it. Okay, because you read the documents from the Council of Nicaea, that's what's being brought up
Mhm.
to
Yeah,
them.
Christ's divinity is a huge point.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even this two natures of Christ, the God and the man, didn't get resolved until Chalcedon in
And the
451.
Holy Spirit part was more.
Pardon?
Oh, yeah, no, but also in Chalcedon, they also looked more into how the Holy Spirit.
Well, anyway, we can discuss that more. But the main thing is that it's not like when Jesus ascended, he said, "Oh yeah, here's the Book of Concord. I'll leave this with you, and this will clear it all up." If you listen to the sermon, you listen to if you come on Fridays to Master's Men.
I would love to, but I got work at 7:30.
Oh, work. Who works? What's this work stuff? Anyway, but the point is you listen to Stephen's sermon. He doesn't get into any of that. You know, he doesn't get into, he's just talking about Christ, who you killed.
And
what-
Stephen Martyr,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Anyway, we're gonna have to wrap it up, but go one last thing on
Really
Frank.
close. It's a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic. Look it up. On your chat, GIT.
No, I know what symbiotic is,
Well,
but
The whole point is, he's man, he's God, he's man, now I'm God, and he's like going, wow, oh, I'm man. And he's like, I'm hurting.
But here's
I'm
the
hurting.
here's the question you're going to be asked. Frank, here's the question you're gonna be asked. Can you show that to me in scripture?
No, you have to have faith. That's
Wow.
what faith is.
That's what a Mormon says. Yeah, that's what a Mormon says, you know? Okay. Anyway, okay, let's take your sheets home. Open the Bibles. I mean, just do, 4 or 5 at a time and stuff like that. Read the actual passages, so that you know that what I'm saying is actually part of the scriptures, like that. I mean, I think it'd be fun to do. What do I know? Any other questions? Any questions? Okay, let's close with Lord's Prayer. Yeah.